All right, I think we're hitting critical mass. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for this webinar titled Social Ground Truthing Climate Change Research, Centering Community in Research Partnerships. We're really lucky to have you all join us for this discussion about this really innovative model. We have a full agenda today, so we're going to get started with some remarks from the California, excuse me, the California Strategic Growth Council's Executive Director, Lynn von Koch-Liebert.
Thank you, Kieran. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for being here today. We are excited to celebrate and discuss the success of our Round 1 climate change research grants and talk about the transformative community partnership model found within the CCR program. Climate change mitigation and resiliency have long been central to the Strategic Growth Council vision of livable communities. We recognize that in order to achieve that mission, research into the issues affecting our communities is critically important, particularly for under-resourced communities and California Native American tribes. Cultivating partnerships and collaboration between researchers, community-based organizations, and state agencies have also been paramount in the evolution of this work. For SGC, bottom-up strategies and community participatory process are key for multi-benefit outcomes and context-sensitive solutions. With this understanding, we developed a unique grant program that not only invests in cutting-edge research, but helps advance the state's key climate goals like 30 by 30, but also it requires researchers to partner with communities to create and execute projects that support near-term action. This past month, we've closed out our first grant of CCR funding and wanted to create an opportunity for our researchers and community partners to reflect on how this participatory research model has driven change in communities. We hope today's webinar sparks reflection around current research paradigms and fosters continued coordination and collaboration between communities, researchers, and state agencies. It is my great pleasure to introduce our guest facilitator today, who is not only a council member for the Strategic Growth Council, but the Chancellor of the University of California, Merced. Dr. Juan Sánchez Muñoz is native Californian whose parents immigrated from Mexico. He received his bachelor in psychology from UC Santa Barbara and both his master's in Mexican American Studies and his PhD in education from UCLA. Chancellor Muñoz has a rich background in both research and community engagement and can really speak to both sides of the CCR program model. Please join me in welcoming Chancellor Juan Sánchez Muñoz.
Thank you, Lynn. Thank you all for joining us, and thank you for that very kind introduction. I can't tell you what a delight it is for me to be part of this conversation, to accentuate not just the efforts of the Strategic Growth Council as a council member, but this particular program, the CCR program. So often in the space of higher education, we think about the faculty member in a laboratory, either developing some innovation theoretically or some kind of product, something that's derived in a laboratory, but we often lose sight of the translational sort of activity that takes place from the point of the basic science development translated to some sort of applied circumstance. This is so important in particular with this program and the topic of today's webinar discussion having to do with centering communities and research partnerships. The importance of campuses, academic environments, laboratories, both public and private, to work effectively in an engaged, authentic way with community partners simply can't be underestimated or underemphasized. And so today's panelists will speak precisely to how they work in the community to work with not just institutions, but nonprofits and others to advance this work, in particular in this case having to do with climate and resilience studies. Climate resistance and sustainability in the case of UC Merced are really at the core of the campus. It's what we study. It's our very buildings that we occupy on our campus. Are the only UC campus that is completely LEED certified. It was the first public research university in the country to be carbon neutral. And so these sort of these foci are so critically important to campuses like ours, but also others. So it's just a delight to be here and be just a small part of this important conversation. Of course, we're going to hear from our panelists in just a minute, but as a council member and someone that is increasingly concerned with how we translate academic, laboratory, both public and private science, basic science, translated into some applied practice that benefits and obviously improves the lives of the people that we hope to serve, is just so critically important. So it's a privilege to be with this group today and just to offer some introductory remarks about the importance of not just the Strategic Growth Council, your leadership, but also programs like CCR and how it enables what we call community-based scientists and practitioners to undertake work that we're able to see immediately improve the lives of the communities that we hope to serve. With that, I'd like to introduce Montre Spikes, who will introduce our moderator, Kieran, and our panelists themselves. Do we have Montre joining us?
Yeah, can you hear me now?
We can.
Awesome. Sorry about that. A lot of things going on at my screen. Hello, everyone, and thank you, Chancellor. I am Montre Spikes, the Science Fellow here at SGC's Climate Change Research Program, and I want to give you guys a brief overview of the CCR program. So the CCR program was established in 2017 by Assembly Bill 109. This statute allocated $34 million to be distributed over 3 rounds of funding. Funded projects were required to focus on reducing carbon emissions, increase clean energy adaptation, and improve resiliency for Californians. But in addition to requirements set by statute, the Strategic Growth Council also required successful applicants' projects to demonstrate 6 qualities. The research had to be interdisciplinary, integrate climate vulnerability and climate smart communities, incorporate meaningful engagement, and be developed with equity and outcomes in mind. And lastly, the results of the study had to be shared with communities and state agencies as well as policymakers. The hope is in doing this was to ensure that research conducted would be directly relevant to the needs of the community. This model also ensured that research results, including policy recommendations, were shared with the host communities. We recently closed out the first round of funding, where we distributed $10.5 million in grants to 10 grantees. Our grantees came from various institutions throughout the state, with 7 coming from the University of California system, 2 coming from the California State University system, and 1 national lab. The partners of our grantees were equally diverse, the most common coming from community-based organizations, as well as advocacy groups, followed by local, regional, and tribal governments. And then we have a few partners that were universities, consultant firms, as well as private industry. In order to ensure that the most in need Californians benefited from this research, we required grantees to directly work with disadvantaged communities. These projects varied in scale from developing statewide tools to determine how climate resilient investments affect displacement to neighborhood projects focused on how low-income communities can most cost-effectively cool their homes. You may also notice that there is a concentration of projects around California research universities. One of CCR's continued goals is to expand these projects and practices throughout the state. So what do the grantees and partners think about the CCR model? Here we have 2 quotes, one from our grantees and 1 from our partners. Our grantee said, "We were able to reach over 400 people through the work and would not have been able to reach them or their constituencies of our collaborating organizations without their partnerships." And our partner said the CCR program model led to a grant with the same partners that they had in the grantee sponsored by CCR that expanded this work nationally, and it had helped them secure foundation grants to support even wider dissemination and improve their online tool building. So with that brief overview, if you would like to learn more about the CCR program and our funded projects, feel free to email us at research@sgc.ca.gov. And you can check out our website at sgc.ca.gov/program/climate research. And if you're interested in the individual projects, we do have the exit presentations up on the California Strategic Growth Council's YouTube channel. With that, I will turn things over to Kieran, the Deputy Director of the Equity and Government Transformation, to introduce our panelists.
Thanks so much, Trey, and thank you again to all of our participants. Just in the last few minutes, I've seen we've tipped up over 80 folks. That's an excellent turnout for this conversation. And just before I jumped into our incredible panel, I wanted to also offer up that this webinar may be a little bit different for folks who are used to joining conversations about research and research outcomes. Trey just mentioned our round 1 exit interviews and panels. That's where you're going to be able to find a lot of the information about the actual science and the research outcomes that were funded through this program, including some of those near-term tools that communities are using to advance policy and systems change work right away. What we are doing with today's webinar is lifting up another portion of this program and this model, which is the community participatory element of this program. We see the program as really a unique approach in grant making around research, where there's a requirement that community partnerships and community organizations are included as funded partners in the program from the outset. And so as part of that, we wanted to lift up some of the brilliance that our community partners are bringing to these research programs. And to facilitate that, we've invited an incredible panel to share with us a little bit more about their experience. And so now I'd love to transition into introducing that panel and really asking our panel to help paint a picture around how a program like this is leading to a more community participatory environment and building capacity within research. So our panel includes Bernadette Austin, who is the Executive Director of the Center for Regional Change at UC Davis. Hi, Bernadette. Notably, Bernadette is also on the faculty executive committee for the UC Davis College of Agricultural and Environmental Sciences, and a member of the advisory committee to the Office of Health Equity at the California Department of Public Health. In addition to Bernadette, we are joined by Gurjeet Singh, who is a policy consultant at the Asian Pacific Environmental Network. Gurjeet is a proxy member on the California Air Resources Board Environmental Justice Advisory Committee and is a champion for addressing climate change through a public health lens. And then last, but certainly not least, we are joined by Ben Russak, who is the Director of Public Partnerships at the Liberty Hill Foundation, where among so much else, he is the architect of the Empower Regional campaign and helped develop the incredible stakeholder engagement process that led to LA County's first ever sustainability plan. So with that, I'll turn it over to our panel. Go ahead, Bernadette.
Hi there, can everyone hear me? Okay, great, I see that. Thank you so much. I encourage folks to use the Q&A function, and we're happy to start responding. And I put in the chat a link for a little more information about our project. So I'm here to talk with you today about the Transportation Equity and Environmental Justice Advisory Group, which is a mouthful, and an acronym that we use is TJAG. We are a coalition of 7 UC campuses, USC, and the Lawrence Livermore Labs that work collectively with dozens of community partners in the initial year of this particular grant fund. And I think something that's really important to highlight is that this work really transcended this particular research collaboration and has borne really wonderful fruit since then. So next slide. So here's a photo of our first and only in-person gathering, but what we would do is we would convene in person and then also virtually due to the pandemic. But the gathering was really important. You can just see here that there was such a great diversity of age, ethnicity, just of these particular participants. But there's some really wonderful perspectives from the public, private, and nonprofit sectors. So next slide. Here's a brief summary of some of the organizations that were involved. So again, we had community-based organizations, and you may recognize some of those names. We also worked with research nonprofit groups, also some other names that you might recognize on that list. And we did work with policymakers and regulatory agencies. So we would always have a representative from local government. We often had one from Northern California, one from Southern California, and we did have representation from state agencies. We had notably folks working in diversity, equity, inclusion from state agencies, and we also had guest speakers who participated in TJAG meetings. Next slide. So how did we do this? A really big component of what we did was focusing on building trust. So members of the TJAG would come together for half-day workshops, again, in person and mostly virtually. In between those half-day workshops twice a year, we would have working groups that would really focus with the particular projects that comprised this larger research effort. And we collaborated on what we call community engaged research. And if you want to go to the next slide, I really want to emphasize these were some of the key recommendations from the TJAG. I think that I'd like to think that we as a university and academic partners approach this with a sense of cultural humility. And I will say that myself and many of my colleagues learned a lot through this process on how we can be better individually and organizationally in community engaged research. So here are three things I just wanted to highlight. The first is, and people are very aware about this, it's so important for researchers and community partners to connect early in the development of a project. And we certainly found ways that we could have really improved this particular collaboration if we had collaborated even earlier. The second important finding is that we need to understand that building relationships takes time and resources. So in addition to just gathering and thinking about the content, we made sure that there was really a space for folks to connect, to network, to have really deep conversations, to be vulnerable, to identify issues of power sharing and power dynamics. And so there was a lot of trust building, I believe, that went on as part of this process. And ultimately, that is one of the things that really benefited future collaborations that were coming out as a result of this. And the third piece I hinted at earlier was that we need to explain that power sharing is key to developing these meaningful and mutually beneficial relationships. What that means is equal footing in making decisions, equal footing in putting forward recommendations and deliverables. And you can go to the next slide. So what are we doing from here on out? Oh, Teresa's almost getting there. There we go. So one piece is some of the partners, for example, UC Berkeley and USC, have continued to collaborate with members of the TJAG, the member individuals and the member organizations. And I thought that was a really important outcome, is that this is continuing to seed continued collaborations, and these relationships are being developed and having far-reaching opportunities for benefiting the topics of sustainability, equity, and more. We also believe that there is even greater policy impact. So when we bring the information from, for example, research partners and community partners together, that is so much richer. And so examples are improving and informing efforts around AB 617 and clean mobility options. And the third piece that was really important was connecting with public agency partners, certainly state agencies, but also those who are working at a local and regional level doing implementation. So next slide, please. So if you have additional questions, I'll put this information in the chat, and I appreciate any additional discussion and Q&A by using the function below. Thanks so much. And I'll turn it over to the next speaker.
Thank you, Bernadette. That was really interesting to hear about. So I'll be talking about the Toxic Tides project. I joined the Toxic Tides team last year in the last leg of a 3-year partnership between several community groups, next slide please, and researchers. So we had researchers from UC Berkeley, UCLA, and Climate Central, and then me and a colleague from Asian Pacific Environmental Network. And then we had a Central Coast Alliance United for a Sustainable Economy, PSR-LA, Physicians for Social Responsibility, Public Health Institute, and We Act for Environmental Justice. And between the 5 of us, we represented, the 3 of us at the top represented various regions in California, North, Central, and South. and Public Health Institute and We Act were sort of general advisors. And that's just to kind of speak to the regional variability that this project took on. Next slide, please. So the main objective of the Toxic Tides project was to gain an understanding of sea level rise, or SLR, and coastal flooding threats to hundreds of hazardous sites in environmental justice communities along the coast of California. Some of these hazardous sites include facilities such as refineries and power plants, as well as sites like landfills and Superfund cleanup sites. So the main thing was looking at when sea level, currently is rising, but when it hits a critical point in 2050 or 2100 or beyond, what's going to happen to these sites that are on the coast and will get flooded and possibly release toxic exposures. So another key part of the project was also to examine demographic indicators such as education, linguistic isolation, et cetera, in communities, in the environmental justice communities that are so often close to these hazardous facilities, and sort of their ability to adapt to or to be resilient to those risks. And then the last step of this project was to also broadly communicate findings to inform decision-making that would protect vulnerable communities. Next slide, please. So I'm going to go into a little bit more about the community partnership process. So here's our team of researchers and the Community Advisory Committee. We met every few weeks or so. And between the two teams, we had an iterative and cyclical process throughout all stages of the project, including like the initial research steps where the research team was looking at what types of facilities to examine. The Community Advisory Committee was very involved in even setting up the research project. And so how it worked was the research team would sort of create something or propose something, and then the advisory committee would provide feedback from a community-focused lens, and then the research team would go back and incorporate those suggestions. And this process led to several outputs that would not have been created without this process. Next slide, please. So some of these outputs include these four things, and I'll go more into detail into two of them. So the Community Advisory Committee we looked at what are facilities and issues that we face in our communities that we want the researchers to look at. So for example, in the Central Coast, there's a nuclear power plant that they wanted to make sure this type of facility was included. So we uplifted additional facilities, as well as demographic indicators, like what markers of vulnerability might be informative in this sort of research. The second one is we advocated for additional demographic information. So actually that's kind of repetitive, but to have this demographic information to be overlaid with the at-risk sites to make sure that on the map that shows which sites are at risk, that we can also see at the same time the demographic makeup of the local community. And that one I will go into more detail. But then we also offered community narratives with local industrial history. So on the website, we have sort of the technical maps, and then we also have like a story behind it with some case studies in particular areas. And then the last one is that in the dissemination phase of the project, we hosted stakeholders in outreach workshops and synthesized their input into recommendations and next steps. Next slide, please. So these two I'll be going into detail. Next, go ahead. So this is the demographic map. This is one of 3 maps that exist on the website. And this didn't exist before in the first version of the website. So this shows here with the gray circles, these are facilities that are at risk of being flooded in 2100. And then in the legend on the left side, you can see the various indicators that you can click on to kind of overlay onto the map. So this one is clicked for % in poverty. And so you can see the darker it is, the more people living in poverty in that area. And so it's just really indicative of showing where the facilities, if the facilities are clustered in certain areas or certain communities with certain demographics, et cetera. Next slide, please. And then the last thing I wanted to highlight was the stakeholder workshops. So we had 4 online workshops with over 350 attendees. And this was entirely led by the Community Advisory Committee. We had a statewide and regional workshops just because we wanted to engage people in different regions because of the varying issues that they face in communities. We had community-based organizations, state and regional agency staff, elected officials, some media as well. And what was really rewarding from these workshops was presenting the information and getting feedback on it, and then having the participants sort of take it forward in terms of what needs to happen next. Engaging participants to guide the conversation in terms of like what the next steps are. And this is, frontline community members saying like, we need toolkits to help us advocate for this site near our community. Or it would be agency staff saying like, we need to know from community members, like, what are your priorities, sort of thing. And so it was my personal project was to sift through pages and pages of discussion from those 4 workshops and to synthesize it into a policy fact sheet, which is on the next slide. Next slide, please. Sorry, back one. So, and this is just a screenshot of that. This isn't even the whole thing. This is, there's, I think, 2 more pages, but we took all of the discussion and turned it into a cohesive document it's directed towards state agencies, regional agencies, anyone who is sort of working in this space, anyone who's in a position of power. And then we also have a section for local community, what members of the local community or community groups can do, or even local government can do to further work on this. And then what this grant has enabled us to do now is to actually, we're in the process of scaling this tool up nationally. So we were able to get a grant from the US EPA to move forward with scaling this up nationally. So that's really exciting for us, and hopefully is indicative of the power of community engaged research. Next slide. Next slide, please. Thank you so much. That is all from me, and I'm going to paste in the chat the link to the website, and any if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to email the Toxic Tides email address. And I will pass it on to Ben.
Great, thank you, Gurjeet. Yeah, this is a great, really grateful to be here in part of this participation. I'm here to talk a little bit about a great project we did with the California Community Center for Sustainable Communities at UCLA, coupling community knowledge with big data tools to facilitate equitable energy transitions. It was really looking at the potential for community scale solar and energy storage in California disadvantaged communities. And the chief impetus of this project was to acknowledge a gap between the push for necessary and desirable equity energy transitions in disadvantaged communities and the limitations imposed by somewhat arcane regulations and deficient energy grid infrastructure. But I'll be talking about this a little bit less on the technical side of these things and more as an intermediary, because our work at Liberty Hill, maybe next slide, please. Our work at Liberty Hill is more focused on the connections with community partners. And we had a host of community partners involved in this project that were very much all across LA County, a variety of geographies from South LA, Inglewood, San Gabriel Valley, San Fernando Valley, Chinatown, Southeast LA County, port and gateway cities, and a broad area of issue areas of expertise as well across public health, environmental justice, community land trusts and housing, sustainable development. So what we ended up was really robust discussions with engagement and broad co-learning opportunities with this engagement of these community partners. Next slide, please. So Liberty Hill, a little background on us, you know, and why we're going to be coming at this from a little bit different perspective is we were neither the research agency or the community-based organizations. We were the convener and the connector. And what we are is we're an LA-based public foundation founded in 1976 that's focused on fueling grassroots organizing. We do strategic grant making and capacity building for social justice organizations. And what this amounts to is trust-based philanthropy. We're looking at things through an equity lens to make sure the way we do the work is as important as what we do, as well as power sharing, like who's at the table, who has a voice. The closest to the pain should be the closest to power. And it's about mission-aligned investing focused on change, not charity. So this idea of participatory action research, next slide, please, that is evident in the climate change research program really is an issue near and dear to our heart. So we heard about this program, we were very intrigued, and in March 2018, we were approached by UCLA with a draft proposal. It was highly technical. Our initial reaction was it was perhaps too wonky for our partners, great infrastructure, arcane regulations, but the potential for valuable co-learning was really evident to us immediately. One focus was on an Energy 101 curriculum to provide valuable information to CBOs, and the ability for CBOs to contribute significant community expertise to the development of a solar prioritization tool that would account for grid limitations and support the identifications of potential sites for community solar and storage development in disadvantaged communities across LA County. Plus, we were currently working with UCLA and the Center for Sustainable Communities on stakeholder engagement for the LA County Sustainability Plan. So we knew their heart was truly in authentic community engagement. And this is why we talk about like moving at the speed of trust, right? This is a big deal for these processes, has been indicated by our previous panelists. So we met with our CBOs to run the proposal by them, engage interest, and this is where the speed of trust kicks in. It's not a Ferrari, it's more like a trolley car moving at the speed for everybody to be able to walk on, you know. We wanted to make sure that there was sufficient alignment with our CBO partners, at their missions, that they had the capacity to participate, and what level of compensation they would need to do so. So there was alignment between the project and the capacities. And after speaking with them, we did recommend moving forward with the project, and we reconvened with UCLA. We set the budget and revised the scope of work based on the CBO's input in collaboration with the center at UCLA. Next slide, please. So after the award was granted, we had a kickoff meeting with UCLA and the community-based organizations. We were understanding a somewhat wide variety of capacity and interest in the program. One staff member of a CBO called it the missing piece of energy equity policy, which was very central to their mission, while others saw it more as a capacity building opportunity to increase their knowledge in an area that intersected with their primary work in other issue areas. This provided for a diversity of conversation, I think, that was really important in the process. So what we came up with was what one member called an a la carte grant making strategy, using baseline grants for all groups to attend the education sessions and provide feedback on the tool with their community expertise. And this was coupled with a bunch of quote unquote menu options to include the ability to create proposals informed by the tool, identifying actual sites in their neighborhoods, and also to be able to engage communities as part of that process if they wish to go that extra step, and also be able to do more in-depth case studies should that be warranted. Now, the discerning attendee viewer here will notice that this was all scheduled to happen in March of 2020. And so also you might surmise that this did not go according to plan, and it did not. So with the flexibility provided by the program, by the Strategic Growth Council, we really went on hiatus for a year and came back and did a reorientation to the materials that we've gone over to make sure everybody was up to snuff, some staff members changed, And then we refocused around the proposals, and everybody did a proposal in their neighborhood. It was extremely valuable, and ended up being something that is going to be able to be used by each organization moving forward in terms of getting future funding. Next slide, please. Last slide here. So really, I just want to close with this idea of the importance of participatory research in programs like this. You know, we were doing this work back in for decades now, and as philanthropists, we often pay for what the public sector is not doing. And this was an opportunity. This was a really amazing thing that the public sector doing participatory research, allowing for regional and local analysis from the ground up. You know, I mean, this is something that takes time. And it's something that we need in order to be, there's a lot of programs out right now that have to do with regional planning, that have to do with, like there's the, Community Economic Resilience Fund. There's planning that goes into work before implementation happens. But before planning happens, you need the research to be able to see, what planning should be addressing. These proposals that were made and this work showed that the ideals of equitable energy transitions were not possible at the scale people wanted it to happen because of regulations and grid infrastructure. So, planning now has to address these issues moving forward to be able to get to a place where real implementation can occur. Without this knowledge, without this ability for community-based organizations to do this, there will be no alignment with the grand designs of California, greenhouse gas reduction goals and the other state programs that are seeking to address that. So really kudos to this program for being here. Thank you for the opportunity to present, and look forward to hearing the discussion that follows.
Wonderful. Thank you, Ben, and to all of our panelists for their quick but informative presentations. We hope the next about 20 minutes will help to go a little bit deeper on some of these pieces. Before I jumped in with questions from the audience, I wanted to turn it over to Chancellor Muñoz for some reflections and then maybe some questions for our panelists to kick us off.
Yeah. Thank you, Karen. I'll tell you, Gurjeet and Ben and Bernadette, this has been a master class in thoughtful, dynamic, and relevant, engaged, grounded research that has meaning. I tell you, the privilege of being able to listen to dynamic, disruptive, transformational thinkers like you is really a privilege. I'll tell you, I'm curious. I have just a couple of thoughts that I wanted to see if I could get Bernadette to respond with to begin with. And, she, like I, work at an institution of higher learning. It has its own culture. Sometimes it's inviting and engaging. Other times it projects a different ethos. We'll just leave it at that. So I'm just curious, how what are some of the challenges that you learn and things, just insights from trying to bridge that gap between campuses like ours, dedicated to the public good, and yet sometimes need to be reminded that the public also understands what's good for it. So I'm just a few observations.
Yeah, so as you know, because you're in the university system, and universities in general, but institutions and bureaucracies more broadly, are not built to contract and have vendor relationships with small organizations, and that has some pretty far-reaching implications. And so, speaking for myself, we really worked to create systems to have stipends and subcontracts with CBOs, and we're really working to changing that systemically within our university system. There's some really great questions in the Q&A, and I just want to make sure that we're addressing some of those. And for example, the funding. So I think I'll talk about funding briefly. Of course, funding is important. Another thing that I've learned from this process is I think it's really important to seek to fund community-based partners commensurate with other researchers. And so, if a researcher is going to be compensated $25,000 a year to participate, that's a level that a CBO should be compensated, or $50,000, or whatever that commensurate level is. So I think that's a really important honoring of their knowledge, and funding this is also a message for the state, funding some of the what I call the barriers to participating in community engaged research. A big challenge is food. There's a lot of barriers on paying for food, but if you host a meeting in person in the evenings, you need to provide people food. I mean, that's fundamental. And the last piece I'll just say is that I'm talking a lot about funding, but I think another piece is in what organizations are spread so thin, what other resources or compensation can we provide? And so, for example, providing networking, helping while we're doing our research, connecting these CBOs so they can learn more about how there can be more of a career and college pipeline for the youth in their community. It might be brokering conversations with policymakers and leveraging those positions of powers that we sit in.
Right. Let me take advantage of that point right now and ask something that Gurjeet talked about in terms of, she talked about synthesizing the input of stakeholders and their into some kind of document. And so when you have these convenings that you're describing, Bernadette, when you're asking these groups to come in the evening, leave their children with someone and pay for childcare, or bring their children and have to feed them. And so, Gurjeet, as you're bringing these stakeholders together for their input, what was the general reaction to seeing their insights and input codified in some document that seemed to enjoy the credibility of these sort of empowering sort of agencies? In other words, they saw their insights developed in a document that would then inform the application of said insights. I'm just, what your thoughts about that process?
Yeah, so that policy fact sheet, it was sort of like the culmination piece of the project. We didn't actually get any additional feedback after or reactions after people saw it, but I do think folks were definitely appreciative of having the space to be in the same room as agency staff, as elected officials or their staff, regional agencies and whatnot, and to know that this is a space where they will be heard. Originally, we were thinking of having our breakout discussions by sector, by community groups in one room, and then agencies, staff in another room. And that's a different sort of way to move things forward. But we thought, why not give we have sort of the audience of the decision makers sort of at the so-called top. We have the knowledge of the community members. This all needs to happen at the same time in the same room. All these people need to be together, and I really feel like that led to such a rich discussion, several rich discussions on what needs to happen. And then one person might say this needs to happen, but then somebody from a different sector would say, well, here's the barriers to that. And it was sort of back and forth. So somebody at the state might say, well, there's funding barriers to that. Somebody in the community might say, community members just don't have time for that much work, or filling out lengthy funding applications and things like that. So I think people were generally just appreciative of having that collaborative space overall throughout the project. Does that answer the question?
Yes, of course. And then Ben, I tell you, I have a final observation, a question for you, and then we're going to turn it to Kieran to moderate some of the questions that are in the chat. But years ago, a colleague of mine from UC Irvine named Diego Vigil and I wrote a chapter in a book edited by Juan Mora on grounded, authentic, participatory research. There was a gentleman by the name of Américo Padres 50 years ago, 60 years ago, who talked about when researchers come into communities, very often the communities find them fraudulent, inauthentic, insincere, and sometimes manipulate the circumstances that the scientist is so-called observing, right? This is what you are proposing in some ways is a paradigmatic shift into how sort of science is translated, applied, and informed. And so you said something, there was a sentence. I had a question prepared for you, Ben, but you provoked me in a different direction with the sentence in your slide. So because I think Gurjeet and Bernadette are speaking to a point in your slide that you made, I'd like for you to speak about it, and then we'll turn it over to Kieran. But explain to me what you believe is captured in this proposition of moving at the speed of trust.
Well, it's all about relationships, right? And Liberty Hill's had relationships with CBOs now for 45 years. We're an in the trenches ally with them, and we're able to, we have discussions with them. We're really trying to gauge It's not just about like, hey, do you have the capacity for this, and how much money do you need for this? I think it was Mike Antos in the questions who brought up an important thing about engagement overwhelm. And, we're talking about research here right now. First of all, we have to look at what that research is. And is it something that we need? If we talk about ground truthing in an area that has been underdeveloped and underanalyzed, that takes years to do and it's really important. And CBOs will have a great amount of capacity for that. But it has to, we don't need any more air monitoring in poor communities. Okay. So, if we're talking about it starts with that ability to be aware of the priorities of the CBOs and be able to be in a teachable position with them at all times, because there are always blind spots. As a foundation, we don't know what's going on in the trenches. We can call ourselves an ally, or we can ally with them, but it's about that relationship and maintaining that relationship and having an ongoing dialogue with the community-based organizations, so that when we end up in these conversations, we're able to say, well, this isn't really going to work. This is great research, but we really need to look at this. Goes back to my point about research, planning, and implementation, right? If this isn't going to lead to something that is going to be impactful to the communities, then why are we doing research and why are we doing planning in the first place? So when we get to this point of doing research, a lot of times it's like a light touch with the CBOs just to make sure it's oriented okay. And this was a fairly light touch with this, but then when you get into things like planning and implementation, you step it up and the community becomes more involved. So it's about honoring the capacities, the missions, and also coordinating, looking at things as a landscape of funding. This is the last thing I'll say about this. As a foundation, we need to not be saying, hey, do this, and hey, do this, and here's this, and here's this, and have 17 different projects that we're funding them for. We need to look at them and say, let's look at your mission. Let's find the things that we can coordinate into funding that will help advance your mission. And this was a part of that. It was a part of that we were able to incorporate that allowed this project to move forward in a meaningful way.
So Ben, I heard you talk about research predicated on relationships that are reciprocal and relevant with equity. And on that note, let's turn it over to Kieran to present you with some questions that have appeared in the chat.
I love that alliteration. Excellent. Thank you, everybody, for the presentations. And I'm kind of looking through the chat. We've got a couple of themes emerging. And so I think this last discussion, Ben, right now touches on a theme I'm seeing in the chat around engagement fatigue. But I think, on the other side of that is also making sure that as we talk about participatory processes, we are prepping our community partners for success in engaging with institutions of power. And so I wonder if our panelists could kind of just speak to this idea of, if I'm a community organization, or Ben, in the example of being a kind of a bridge building organization, how can we best prepare and support communities and community organizations to partner within academia and research and avoid this piece around fatigue?
I'll go ahead and jump in. That's a really, really good question that we grapple with ourselves. I do want to just say that, Ben raised the issue of the pandemic, and we face that challenge too. So what we found is that we were supporting organizations that were seeking to do long-term work. That's why they were interested in research, and yet they had really immediate proximal issues. They were not in they may not have been in the business of providing food, supporting shelter, and suddenly they found themselves doing that work. And so there is the issue of community engagement, but just in general, CBOs are spread very thin. If you talk to people working in education and healthcare, they're going to tell you they're spread very thin. So I think it's about being very strategic. The meeting I had right before this one is talking with people doing research in where I'm located in the Sacramento region on how we can do a better job of coordinating when we're putting out surveys. Is it possible for someone to receive one survey where 3 or 4 different organizations are gathering information? So I would encourage you in the research spheres to think about that. Connect with your municipal planning organizations, connect with your local research institutions, and see, instead of sending out a bunch of surveys, can we do this better? And then around engagement, go to the people. Rather than asking them to come to you and fill out your form and attend your meeting, go to the local chamber of commerce, go to your faith-based organizations, go to where people are convening, and you can better target those populations.
I mean, I'll flip this too. I mean, I think, yes, it's really important to give, like, the education that's provided as part of the grant that we were involved in was critical to the CBOs to be able to participate in this, right? So having that education component is critical. It is also critical to support the education of the research partners in this, and being able to, and have their flexibility to come at something with, like, here's what we're thinking. Is this even the right question? You know, and then once you get that, like, okay, yes, this is the right question, then be able to go, well, we see what you're saying, let's change this. I can't tell you how many times in the process of this grant that Felicia and Stephanie over at UCLA were like, oh, well, that changes things. Let's see what else we can work into this tool, you know? So it's a co-learning. And that's something I really want to emphasize. Mm-hmm. So it's both supporting the CBOs and the researchers.
Yeah. And Kieran, I'm not a panelist, but I can't help but be compelled as a former academic. And universities are attracted to that opportunity to be able to interact in that sort of way. There's a curiosity that's part of the prevailing culture of academic environments, and so being able to have that aha moment, as Ben very academically described, I think is something that resonates with the culture and the purpose of academic institutions. And so how do we create those meaningful engagements? Again, that sort of reciprocity, that parity of reciprocity, and that relationship to help inform of our activities, both in the hard and soft sciences, I think is imperative moving forward. So I apologize for the comment, but the question was just too inviting.
And thank you for that. This is actually, I'm not an expert in community engaged work. This is my first position in this type of work. But something I've learned that is sort of like something that really causes fatigue is not engaging as equal partners. And I've seen this personally in another project that I'm part of, is sort of the research or academic or whichever partner moving forward, and then coming to us to be like, here's what we did, give us your feedback. And we would have, multiple layers of feedback on that, but then it not being taken seriously, or it just being like included as an appendix. Like here's what the CBO said. We tried our best to incorporate it, but our process is such and such. So that's something that really truly causes fatigue, that it's to the point that I've seen people drop out of advisory committees and whatnot. So I'll leave it at that. I can't say too much more on the specifics of this.
Yeah, no, thank you for your perspective on that. And I think this conversation, Ben, you teed it up again perfectly. The other side of the coin is, right, the capacity that these partnerships are building within academia and research to do this kind of partnership work on a more consistent basis. And there's a question in here from, I believe, Mike, around building the long-term capacity and the pipeline of researchers with university students as well participating in this research. And so maybe a generalized question in that realm is, from your perspective, of course, participating in this kind of program and these research partnerships, how you saw that actually building capacity within academia.
Well, I'll start. I know Dr. Muñoz probably has a lot of good ideas and insights as well. But what I'll start with is, we're continuing to look at, improving diversity, equity, and inclusion. And when you have people who have the lived experiences of Californians, they have that lived experience that they can then bring to this. So I would actually say that it's really important to have faculty and researchers that look like the communities you are quote unquote studying. That's sort of, for me, that's the highest level. But then building towards that, I think it's really important for there to be, I want to call it capacity building. I will say community-based partners have incredible amounts of knowledge. They just don't have the necessarily the capacity in many ways, they may not be able, even if they wanted to, they may not have the ability to fundraise and attract and retain a researcher to their team, for example. And that's where partnerships, I think, are really valuable. So forming that, like I said, that sort of trust and partnership over the long term. So it's not a one-off, great, here's a funding opportunity, let's create a partnership, but have partnerships already so that they can act. And that perhaps is something that my other panelists can talk to, is establishing these relationships long term. The third thing I'll highlight is I talked about cultural humility. It's really important for researchers who are doing this work to not see themselves as the ones holding the knowledge and sharing it out, but also receiving this information and recognizing community-based partners for the incredibly valuable data that they have.
I love that. Thank you, Bernadette. I'm getting told by our team that we're coming up on time, and I don't want to cut too much into folks' lunch hour. And so there are a ton of questions that are starting to roll into the chat. And so maybe I'll ask the climate change research team to follow up directly with folks, or maybe perhaps as a follow-up to this webinar, answer some of those questions with any kind of notes or the recording. I think that will help facilitate this dialogue. So kind of just to wrap, I just wanted to thank you all for joining for this conversation. As you can tell, we are very excited about this program and this model. For us at SGC, ground up solutions and innovative solutions that are derived by community are critical to achieving our mission, not just in the research space, but in or across all of our domains. And so we are excited to take a few items to our council actually on April 28th, a week from today, on this very specific topic around capacity building. And so I encourage folks to join there to learn about a new grant program coming out of the Strategic Growth Council that will be focusing on capacity building, addressing some of these challenges around funding, related to partnership costs. Bernadette, you had mentioned food and some of those engagement barriers as well. These continue to be kind of priorities for us to address. I wanted to kind of turn it over with kind of the last 2 minutes to either Lynn or our program manager, Liz Grassi, to speak to any final remarks you had about the climate change research program and to close us out.
Thank you, Kieran. I would just kind of echo gratitude for everybody for participating in this process and then being willing to come and share lessons and thoughts from having gone through this model. As Kieran mentioned, we are really interested in kind of continuing to dig into how this process has worked and how we can continue to educate and inform on this unique type of research community-based model. So thank you again, and I'll hand it over to Liz.
No problem, Liz. All right, everybody, thank you so much for joining us, especially to our panelists and to our guest facilitator, Chancellor Juan Sánchez Muñoz, and then of course to all of you for being here today and engaging in this dialogue. More from us soon. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, everyone.
Hey, Natalie, before we close out, is there a way to save the Q&A session?
Yes, I can save it.
Okay.
Save the chat. And I got screenshots of the questions that we weren't able to get to, and we'll download the attendee report.
Okay.
And we're still live. This is good. Bye, everyone.